This jalapeno cheddar sourdough loaf is my husband's favorite loaf of sourdough bread. It's got a little bit of jalapeno, some sharp cheddar, all in a crusty sourdough loaf. If you like a little kick to your bread, you've got to give this one a try. I'm Amy from amybakesbread.com. Let's make jalapeno cheddar sourdough. It smells so good. I just printed out the recipe for my jalapeno cheddar sourdough bread. You can grab the recipe on amybakesbread.com. Go to the recipe, has all the step-by-step instructions and a recipe card so you can print it out if you want a printed version. Okay, this is one of my favorite loaves. It's actually my husband's favorite. He loves that little spicy kick from the jalapeno. Let's make it together. I start this recipe the same way that I do my classic sourdough bread, and that is with a ripe levain or an active sourdough starter. So the recipe itself calls for the levain, and all that is it's basically a power feed of your sourdough starter. So you take a little bit of your starter, you mix up a levain, and you're gonna use all of that levain in your bake. I think it's especially helpful for somebody who keeps their starter in the refrigerator, who's not maintaining their starter on the counter all of the time, to do that levain style method. I think it's gonna give you kind of a better bread in general. But if you have a ripe, active, bubbly sourdough starter, or you didn't plan ahead and your starter is ripe and active and you've maintained it a few times at least during the week on the counter, you can substitute that bubbly active sourdough starter for the levain. Okay, don't let that part scare you away. That's that beginning part of the recipe. I always start mine with the levain because I want everyone on an equal playing field and every starter to have that feeding, a good power feed before you mix your dough with it. So we're gonna start. I'm using a container today. I like these containers, especially when I'm adding inclusions into my bread. I think it makes it easier to add them, and we're gonna be doing probably some coil folds instead of stretch and folds today with that. So I'm gonna go ahead and add in my bubbly active starter right into the container. We're doing 100 grams of starter. If you go a little bit over or a little bit under, that's okay. If you were using a levain in this, you would have used up all of the starter or the levain that you made. I still have leftover sourdough starter in here, so I'm either gonna use it in another bake today, or I will discard some of it and refeed my starter, or I'm just gonna stick it in the fridge and maybe use it in a few hours, a little bit later, maybe even tomorrow. Next, we're gonna add in our water. And we're gonna start with 350 grams of water. The total water in this is gonna end up being 375 grams. So we're gonna reserve 25 grams of the water to add in a little bit later. This first step that we're doing is called a fermentalize. And all that means is that we're adding the flour, the water, and the starter together. We're mixing it. We're gonna let it sit for about, 30 minutes or so, just to give those gluten strands a little bit of a head start, to get them active and strong, because once we add the salt constricts. Okay, it constricts those strands, and so it's gonna make it like a little bit less chewy, puffy. It doesn't rise, you know, it will rise if you leave it out, but it doesn't rise quite the same. So this just gives it a little bit of a head start. If you thought maybe you don't have enough time, or you want to skip this step, you can add all the water and all the salt and everything right now and just mix it all together and skip the fermentalize step. I do like doing it for like a classic sourdough, and if you have the time, I recommend doing it. We've got our starter, we've got our water in there, time to add our flour. We're gonna do 450 grams of bread flour, and then we're gonna do 50 grams of whole wheat flour. I like using a bread flour and a whole wheat flour combination. I think it gives a little more depth of flavor to your dough. So that's one of the reasons that I like to use it. If you didn't want to use the whole wheat, you could just use all bread flour in this. And this is my whole wheat. I freshly mill it. And I did that earlier today. One thing to keep in mind is as you're adding the ingredients here to your container, the temperature of your ingredients matter. So temperature is really important for a sourdough loaf. I like to keep mine between 76 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That just helps the dough to, ferment at a good place, and it's the optimal temperature that wild yeast and bacteria work together. And that's what I want for my sourdough loaves. So that's the temperature I try most of the time to keep my dough at. Now, does that mean it has to be that temperature? No, it doesn't. Okay, if you're a little bit lower than that, it just means it's gonna take longer for your dough to show all of these signs that we're gonna be looking for. If it's warmer than that, it's gonna go faster. Oh, another thing too, you may have noticed I am using a kitchen scale. I do love, I highly recommend if you're a sourdough beginner or a newbie or even just somebody that wants to be a better baker, use a kitchen scale. Cup measurements are just not as accurate, especially when you're working with this like higher hydration sourdough that you may not know how it's supposed to feel, because it's a lot harder to go by feel when it's higher hydration. That's my own opinion. Anyway, get yourself a kitchen scale if you don't have one. I know it can be like a mental hurdle sometimes, but it is very worth it. Okay, I have mixed up this dough mostly. I like to go around it now. I have this little tool. Got it on Amazon a while ago, and it's so nice to like get into the corners and scrape down the sides of my container, my bowl. Just making sure that this dough is all hydrated. It's got all that water in it. It's all, mostly come together. But you can see it's very sticky, okay? So I'm gonna let this sit. We're gonna cover it and let it sit for 30 minutes. I think I'm gonna stick it in my bread proofer over there. Actually, I'm gonna take the temperature to make sure I know what the temperature is. I always think it's like, just pop a thermometer in your dough. This is like 80 degrees, 81. So I don't need to stick it in my bread proofer right now. I'm gonna leave it on the counter for its first 30 minutes. We'll check the temperature a little bit later too. We'll come back after 30 minutes, add in our salt and our water. And while I'm talking about that, I'm gonna go ahead and measure out my salt right now. I like to do this just so that I don't forget to add it later. Okay, I'm doing 10 grams of salt. I'm just putting that into this bowl, and then I keep my bowl right on top of my container. So I'm gonna remember when I come back, okay, I've gotta add the salt, I've gotta add a little reserved water as well. While my dough is resting, let's talk about the inclusions we're gonna put into this jalapeno cheddar bread. So I like to prep them while the dough is resting, and then I can keep the cheese in the fridge just so that it's ready to go before I add it into my bread. So I like to grate the cheese myself. Make sure that you do that, or that you could even use cubes of cheese if you wanted to. I like to do that because the pre-shredded stuff you can get at the store often has like a lot of anti-caking agents on it, and that's just, it does not melt into the bread like I want it to. So you could use it in a pinch, but if you can grab a block of cheddar, that is gonna be better. I like a sharp cheddar because that gives you the real flavor in this loaf. And then I just like to grate it into these strips. Some people prefer like cubes of cheese, and that works too. I feel like the cubes of cheese, you tend to get more like pockets of air almost. Not air, but they're like cheesy pockets. They're really good when they're warmed up, but I feel like they can kind of make the loaf look weird if they're not. So it's just personal preference, but you can go ahead and use, what you want to. So I'm getting my cheese grated. And then the jalapeños, let me show you. These are diced green chilies, but I usually can find a jar of diced jalapeños, a can of them. That's what I like to use in this recipe. This is 7 ounces. I usually use a 4-ounce jar, about 100 grams. Drain off the liquid, and I'm just adding in the the actual diced jalapenos. But I couldn't find them when I went to the store. So I'm using these sliced jalapeno peppers instead, and I will just use about 100 grams of them drained. I don't know if I'll give them a rough chop or not. I may just leave them kind of whole, or they're not whole, they're sliced. So I may leave them sliced and see how it turns out, or I may give them a little bit of a rough chop. I like a little bit of jalapeno in every bite, but I don't like to be overwhelmed by the spicy jalapeno. If you wanted more jalapeno flavor, you could obviously add more jalapeno. So I'm prepping these, and we'll get them ready to add into our dough in just a minute. Yum. It's been 30 minutes. We're gonna add in our salt and a little bit of reserved 25 grams of water. You can see how this is looking. If I go in here, see how that gluten is already starting to develop? That's why we do that little fermentalize step. And then we're gonna add in our salt. Salt will shrink that gluten a little bit, but you need salt. So you've got to have that balance of both, but we give it a little bit of a head start doing that fermentalize. And then we're going to add in 25 grams of water. And we just come in with our hands, and we're going to kind of squeeze the dough, pinch it and squeeze it, and just incorporate that salt and that extra water. This is the part I really like. You're just getting your hands all into that dough, and it's kind of fun to work it around. I love to watch the dough develop. I kind of like to do this motion. Once the dough kind of has started to come together like this, you pick the dough up, fling it against your container or your bowl. See how that stretches the gluten strands? That's the goal, is that stretching method. So that's kind of encouraging that gentle gluten development. You can watch the dough start to change. I love that. Okay, once it is mostly together like this, we're gonna cover it back up. I'm gonna check the temperature again. Okay, we're now at about 74, so it's gone down in that half an hour. So I'm gonna stick it in my bread proofer at 78 just to keep it warm. If you didn't have a bread proofer, you could use your oven with the light turned on. You could use a warm appliance, anything that you can find to keep this warm. I have a whole article about this on my website with lots of ideas for how to keep your dough warm. We're gonna wait 30 minutes and come back to this to start our first set of stretch and folds. I do love this proofer because this container fits right into the proofer. I also have another container, and 2 containers can fit into this proofer, which is really, really nice when you're making like multiple loaves of dough. We're gonna set this at 78. This is our first set of folds. Now, typically if I was doing this in a bowl, I would be doing stretch and folds where you reach down and stretch over. And because it's in this kind of a container, I like to do coil folds where you pull up, kind of form a coil, and let it fall back down. I need to use a little bit of water on my hands because this is sticking to my fingers. You don't want to let it tear. Let it fall back down. We're going to cover this, and then on our next set, we'll add in our inclusions. All right, we are on our second set of coil folds in this case, since we're using this container, and we're gonna add in our inclusions right now. So we're gonna put in these jalapenos. Now remember, I usually like to put them in diced. I'm trying it this way today. We'll see how it goes. and then our cheddar cheese. This loaf is one that when I used to teach sourdough classes in my community, my local community, I used to make this for every class, and it was very, very well received. Just looking at this and how they're incorporating in, I think I prefer the diced ones. So that would probably be my recommendation. But we're going to still keep going with this and see how they include in. And I may actually pull some of these off and dice them up. So we're going to get a combination of these whole ones and some diced ones. Okay, I just did a quick dice. I think the diced ones are better. So if you can't find the dice like I couldn't, I think it's worth it to take a minute to just dice them up. I just think that you get little pops of heat throughout a little bit better, but that's completely up to you. We're gonna come back here in 30 minutes and we'll finish adding these in a little bit better as this dough flattens out a little bit during that 30 minutes. It's been another 30 minutes. So we're gonna go ahead and come in here and do some more coil folds, get those jalapeños really all throughout this dough. It's mixing in pretty nicely. If I go in here, I can see it down here. I'm gonna just try to add these in. It may be fun to like even do a couple of these in the middle of the dough. I don't know. All right. Basically done our last folds there. We're gonna come back to this in 30 minutes and check on it again. This is my last set of folds for this jalapeno cheddar loaf. I'm just come in, do a quick up and down coil folds. I think this is gonna turn out so nice. And then we're gonna let it finish rising, maybe another hour and a half to 2 hours at 78 degrees. It's been about 1.5 to 2 hours. Look at how much this dough has spread out. It's risen. You can see that it's doming toward the middle. It's probably 50% risen. So this is ready to be shaped. All right, we've got our jalapeno cheddar loaf. Bringing it out here. Now this dough is kind of sticky. I think the jalapenos also, the canned ones, if you're using fresh, it may be different, but the canned ones make this dough even more, like they change the texture somehow, and it feels so good and so light and airy and fluffy, and I love working with this dough because it just feels that way. But we're just gonna shape it into a circle here, so we're getting ready to shape. And we're gonna let that sit. It's gonna flatten out a little bit. And then once it flattens out, we're gonna be ready to shape it. I have my loaf sitting here. It has nicely flattened out a little bit, and we're gonna go ahead and shape it and put it into our banneton. I like to line my banneton with a hairnet. That way I don't have to use any extra flour when shaping my dough. If you wanted to use extra flour, you'd sprinkle it on now. Use rice flour, use a regular, all-purpose flour here. We're gonna go ahead and just flip this over. You would sprinkle this with a little bit of flour if you wanted to use flour. So we're gonna flip it over and shape it up. Go to the middle, to the edges, and then bring this one over the top. And since we're going into a circle, I like to just bring it around into a round. We're gonna place it into the bowl. If you see any like jalapenos like this, I try to place them in and just cover them up as best I can. Inclusions are bound to pop out a little bit here and there, but and if you do see like a big one popping out, usually I'll remove it because I don't want it to burn when it bakes through in the bottom. But we're gonna go ahead and cover this. We're gonna cold proof this overnight and we'll bake it in the morning. If you wanted to bake it the same day, you could definitely do that. You just need to let it, rest and rise in here for probably another hour or two, and then you could bake it right away. It's the next morning. I've got my dough. I just pulled it out of the fridge. We're going to score the dough. and get it into the oven. I've got a Dutch oven preheating in there. It's at 500 right now. I'm gonna turn the temperature down to 450 after it gets in there. We like to bake with a lot of steam so we get that good rise and a nice crisp crust. After 25 minutes, we will take the lid off and continue baking for about another 20 minutes. I do like to bake on parchment paper. I use this brand from Costco, and it works really well in the Dutch ovens. If you don't want to use parchment paper, you do probably want to protect the bottom of the loaf in some way. You could put like a layer of rice and then put this on top. Well, that is if using parchment paper, but you could also use a silicone sling, anything like that. All right, I'm going to score this now. I'm just gonna do a simple X score. There we go. I'm gonna pop this in the oven. All right, and it goes 25 minutes at 450. Then we'll take the lid off. Whew, moment of truth. This smells, I am smelling the jalapeno here. Oh, gorgeous. So pretty. Here we go. That loaf is incredible. Okay, it's been 20 minutes. I'm pulling this out. We're gonna let it cool and then we'll cut into it. Letting it cool. Here we go. Our loaf has cooled. Look at how gorgeous this turned out. And the smell is intoxicating, honestly. It's so good. A little bit of a crunch. Let's go ahead and cut it open. That is a gorgeous, gorgeous loaf. Oh. Okay, I've got to take a little taste off the corner here. How spicy do you think it's gonna be? Oh man. A little bit of a kick. You know what? This would be so good toasted with some cream cheese on top, like a jalapeno popper. Absolutely incredible. Can't wait for you to try this one. Grab the recipe on amybakesbread.com. You can search for my jalapeno cheddar sourdough.